In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a priceless sapphire vanishes, and with it, the notorious thief, Victor Slade. Was it the cunning accomplice Clara Vane, her silk scarf, hiding secrets? Or the sly jeweler, Mortimer Gryce, whose shop conceals more than gems? Perhaps the envious rival Julian Rook, lurking in the shadows, or the guilt-ridden Inspector Craddock, haunted by a past failure. Only Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and quiet wisdom, can unravel the web of greed, betrayal, and murder. In a village where every rose hides a thorn, the truth is buried, but not for long. Chapter 1. The glitter of greed. The late summer sun cast a golden haze over St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through the ivy-clad walls of the village's cottages. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room, her delicate hands folded around a cup of Earl Grey, the steam curling upward like a question mark. Her lace curtains fluttered in the breeze, framing a view of the high street, where villagers bustled with the day's errands. It was a scene of tranquil routine, yet the air hummed with an undercurrent of excitement. For St. Mary Mead was not accustomed to scandal of the grand sort. Florence Miss Marple called softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of one long accustomed to observation. Her maid, a stout woman with a penchant for gossip, appeared from the kitchen, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Yes, miss." Florence's eyes gleamed, eager to share the tidings that had set the village abuzz. "Tell me again about this theft at Lord Harrington's manor," Miss Marple said, her tone deceptively casual. "The details, if you please. One hears such muddled accounts." Florence needed no further prompting. "Oh, miss, it's the talk of the county. The Ashford sapphire, that great blue stone Lord Harrington's so proud of, stolen right from under his nose during the gala last Saturday. They say it was Victor Slade, dreadful man, known for such things, slipped into the manor, took the gem from the library safe, and vanished like a ghost. Not a trace of him, nor the sapphire, and the police are in a right tizzy." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly, her eyes narrowing as she gazed past Florence to the roses nodding in her garden. "A ghost, you say? Ghosts are rather careless, leaving whispers behind. And what do the villagers make of it?" "They're all aflutter, miss. Some say Slade's halfway to France with the sapphire. Others reckon he's hiding in the woods. Mrs. Bantry swears it's a conspiracy. What with that accomplice of his, Clara Vane, being seen in the village the day before. And then there's Mortimer Gryce, that jeweler, always skulking about with his shifty eyes. Folk think he's in on it, fencing the goods, like Miss Marple's needles, lying idle on the table, seemed to beckon." She took them up, the soft click of their rhythm a counterpoint to her thoughts. "Clara Vane, you say, and Mr. Gryce. Interesting company for a sapphire. Anyone else? Well, there's that Inspector Craddock, ever so serious, poking about the manor, and Julian Rook, that no-good thief from Dannymoth, was at the pub last night, talking big about how he'd have done the job better than Slade. Jealous, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing these names as neatly as her knitting patterns. Clara Vane, with her sharp charm and questionable associates. Mortimer Gryce, whose jeweler's shop held more secrets than trinkets. Inspector Earnest, but perhaps out of his depth. And Julian Rook, whose envy might outstrip his cunning. A cast of characters, each with their own motives, as familiar to her as the village's annual feuds over jam recipes. That evening, the vicarage hosted a small gathering, a pretext for the village to dissect the theft under the guise of tea and charity. Miss Marple, in her black brocade and a hat adorned with a single feather, arrived with her usual air of unobtrusive curiosity. The vicarage drawing room was alive with chatter, the clink of teacups mingling with speculation. Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed with excitement, held court near the fireplace, recounting the gala splendor and its shocking end. Lord Harrington was beside himself, she declared, her voice carrying over the room. The sapphire was in a locked case, guarded by his butler, yet Slade got to it. I saw Clara Vane there, you know, all smiles and silk, but I wouldn't trust her an inch. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, observed Clara Vane. Across the room, the woman was a vision in emerald green, her auburn hair catching the lamplight. She laughed lightly at a gentleman's jest, but her fingers toyed restlessly with a silk scarf. A nervous gesture that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Nearby, Mortimer Gryce stood by a window, his thin lips pursed as he watched the room with the wariness of a cat. Inspector Craddock, in a neat suit, conversed with the vicar, his brow furrowed, as if the weight of the case pressed upon him. Julian Rook, leaning against the doorframe, sipped his tea with a smirk, his eyes darting to Clara and Gryce. In turn, Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her thoughts weaving a pattern from the evening's observations. Clara's unease, Gryce's guarded demeanor, Craddock's tension, Rook's sly glances, each was a thread in a tapestry yet to be revealed. She recalled a village scandal years ago, when a stolen locket had unraveled a web of jealousy and deceit. People, she mused, were much the same, whether pilfering trinkets or priceless gems, as she rose to leave. Miss Marple paused by Clara Vane, offering a gentle smile. "Such a lovely scarf, my dear. Do you wear it often?" Clara's hand stilled on the silk. "Oh, now and then, Miss Marple. It's rather a favorite." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes bright with unspoken thoughts. "A favorite can be so revealing, don't you think?" She stepped into the cool night, the stars above St. Mary Mead as sharp as the questions forming in her mind. The Ashford sapphire was gone, Victor Slade was missing, and 4 suspects stood in the shadows of suspicion. Miss Marple's heart quickened, not with fear, but with the quiet thrill of a puzzle waiting to be solved. Chapter 2. The Accomplice's Alibi. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the village as if it were a watercolor painting yet to dry. Miss Jane Marple stood at her garden gate, her shawl drawn about her shoulders, her eyes tracing the path that led to the high street. The theft of the Ashford sapphire had stirred the village like a stone tossed into a still pond, and the ripples reached even her quiet cottage. Her thoughts, however, were not on the sapphire itself, but on Clara Vane, the woman whose name danced on every tongue as Victor Slade's accomplice. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the pruning shears she held, turned over the details of the previous evening's vicarage gathering. Clara's restless fingers, her too bright laughter, the silk scarf twisted into knots, these were not the marks of an innocent heart. "Florence," Miss Marple called as she stepped back into the cottage, her voice carrying the gentle firmness of one accustomed to being heeded. Her maid appeared, her apron slightly askew, her face alight with the morning's gossip. "Yes, miss. I was just hearing from the milkman. Clara Vane's been telling everyone she was in London the night of the theft, dining with some theater folk. Says she's got proof and all." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, her eyes gleaming with quiet interest. "Proof, Florence. That is most convenient. One does wonder, though, why a woman with proof feels the need to proclaim it so loudly." Florence blinked, her hands pausing on the teapot she was filling. "You think she's hiding something, miss? I think, my dear, that people who are hiding something often hide it in plain sight, like Mrs. Carter's missing silver spoon, which turned up in her own sugar bowl, of all places." Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting basket at her side, though she did not yet reach for her needles. Instead, she gazed out the window, her thoughts weaving a pattern as intricate as her lips. Clara Vane was a Pazula woman of undeniable charm, with auburn hair and a quick tongue, yet her presence at the vicarage had carried an undercurrent of unease. Miss Marple recalled a village girl, years ago, who had lied about a stolen ribbon, with such conviction that only the quiver in her voice betrayed her. Clara's scarf twisting, her overly emphatic alibi, these were threads to be followed. Determined to unravel them, Miss Marple decided to pay Clara a visit. She chose a pretext, as delicate as her own laced handkerchief, a request for a recipe, one that Clara, known for her culinary flair, could hardly refuse. Donning her best hat, a modest affair with a single velvet rose, Miss Marple set out for Clara's cottage, a charming dwelling on the edge of the village, its garden overrun with wild roses and honeysuckle. The path to Clara's cottage wound past the churchyard, where Miss Marple paused to exchange pleasantries with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, who was tending to a flower bed. Mrs. Clement, ever eager to share news, mentioned Clara's recent visitors, a delivery boy, a tailor, and, curiously, a man in a dark cloak who had lingered near the cottage gate the previous evening. A dark cloak. Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes sharpened. How very theatrical. Did you recognize him, Mrs. Clement? No, Miss Marple. It was too dark, and he kept his distance. But it gave me a turn, I can tell you. With all this talk of thieves, one can't be too careful. Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away as she continued her walk. A cloaked figure was an intriguing addition to the tapestry, reminiscent of a village poacher who once skulked about in a hooded coat to avoid notice. At Clara's gate, she paused, noting the neat flower beds and the freshly painted door, its frame marred by a faint scratch, as if a tool had grazed it in haste. A lockpick, perhaps. Miss Marple's mind flickered to a long-ago incident involving a stable boy who had scratched a lock while attempting to pilfer a saddle. Clara answered the door with a smile that was a shade too bright. Her auburn hair swept into an elegant knot, her silk scar, this one, a vivid scarlet, draped over her shoulders. Miss Marple, what a delightful surprise. Do come in. The cottage's interior was as charming as its exterior, with chintz, curtains, and a vase of fresh roses on the table. Clara bustled about, setting out a tea tray with practiced grace, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands as she poured. The recipe for lemon drizzle cake was produced with enthusiasm, and Miss Marple listened politely, her eyes wandering to the room's details. A photograph of Clara with a dashing man who bore a striking resemblance to Victor Slade, a locked desk drawer, a pair of gloves with a faint smudge of ink. Your cottage is charming, my dear, Miss Marple said, her tone warm. You must find it a haven after the bustle of London. I hear you were there during Lord Harrington's gala. Clara's smile tightened, her fingers brushing the scarf. Oh yes. I was dining with Mr. Percival Lang, the theater producer. Quite a splendid evening, oysters, champagne, and a lovely view of the Thames. I've the ticket stub somewhere, and the waiter will vouch for me. How fortunate to have such a clear account, Miss Marple said, her voice as soft as the clink of her teacup. Though one does hear such dreadful things about London waiters, forgetting faces, mixing up dates. I suppose you knew Victor Slade well, being in similar circles? Clara's hand froze on the teapot, her eyes flickering with something akin to alarm. Victor? Oh, we crossed paths now and then. He was ambitious, shall we say, always chasing the next big prize. But we hadn't spoken in months. A falling out, you see, business matters. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. Business matters can be so vexing, like Mrs. Harrow's dispute with the greengrocer over a crate of apples, such misunderstandings. What was the nature of your disagreement, if I may ask? Clara laughed, a brittle sound. Nothing serious, just a difference of opinion on investments. Victor had grand ideas, but I prefer a quieter life. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes resting on the photograph. He does have a certain charm, doesn't he? I saw a picture like that in the village hall once, of a young man who promised a girl the moon and left her with nothing but regrets. Clara's cheeks flushed, and she busied herself with the tea tray, her scarf slipping slightly to reveal a bruise on her wrist, quickly covered. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. A bruise. A scratch on the doorframe. A cloaked figure, the threads were multiplying, each one pointing to a story Clara was not telling. As they chatted, Miss Marple steered the conversation to lighter topics, praising the roses and inquiring about Clara's knack for entertaining. "I hear you're quite skilled with locks," she said, her tone innocent. "A party trick, I believe. My nephew's boy once showed me how to open a suitcase with a hairpin such cleverness." Clara's laugh was more genuine this time, though her eyes remained wary. "Oh, it's just a bit of fun, Miss Marple. Victor taught me ages ago, said it was useful for getting into old trunks at country houses. Nothing serious." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile as soft as the sunlight filtering through the window. "Though one does wonder what other tricks Mr. Slade might have shared." As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused at the door, her eyes lingering on the scratch. "Your door could use a touch of paint, my dear. A mark like that might give the wrong impression." Clara's hand flew to the frame, her fingers tracing the scratch as if seeing it for the first time. "Oh, that must have been the gardener's rake. Clumsy man." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite agreement, though her mind was far from convinced. She stepped into the lane, the scent of honeysuckle mingling with her thoughts. Clara's alibi was polished, her charm disarming. Yet the bruise, the scratch, the photograph, they told a different tale. Miss Marple recalled a village seamstress who had lied about a lover's quarrel, her excuses as carefully stitched as her dresses, yet unraveling under scrutiny. As she walked home, Miss Marple passed the jeweler's shop, where Mortimer Gryce stood in the doorway, his eyes following her with a wariness that bordered on suspicion. She smiled pleasantly, noting the gleam of his watch chain and the locked door behind him. A fence, Florence had called him. And Miss Marple wondered what treasures lay hidden in his safe. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles finally in hand. The click of the needles was a soothing rhythm, a counterpoint to the puzzle forming in her mind. Clara Vane was no mere bystander. Her connection to Slade ran deeper than she admitted, and her alibi, though convincing, had the sheen of a rehearsed performance. The bruise suggested a struggle, the scratch a hurried act, and the cloaked figure a shadow yet to be named. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Inspector Craddock, whose earnestness at the vicarage had been tinged with frustration. She would need to speak with him, to share her observations without seeming to meddle. And then there was Julian Rook, the rival thief, whose envy of Slade might have driven him to more than idle boasts. Mortimer Gryce, too, warranted closer scrutiny. His shop was too conveniently placed, his demeanor too guarded. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple rose to tend her roses, her pruning shears snipping with precision. The garden was her sanctuary, a place where patterns emerged as clearly as in human nature. Clara Vane, she mused, was like a rose, beautiful, fragrant, but with thorns that could draw blood. The question was not whether Clara was involved, but how deeply, and with whom the church bell tolled, its chime echoing over the village. Miss Marple straightened, her eyes bright with resolve. The Ashford sapphire was a glittering prize, but the truth behind its theft was a gem of a different sort, one she intended to uncover. Thread by thread, in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 3. The fences facade. The high street of St. Mary Mead bustled quietly under a sky streaked with the soft pinks of an early autumn dawn. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, walked with measured steps toward the village's modest jeweler's shop, its sign proclaiming Gryce & Sons, fine gems and faded gold lettering. The theft of the Ashford sapphire had cast a shadow over the village, and Mortimer Gryce, the shop's sole proprietor, despite the plural promise of the sign, was at the heart of whispered suspicions. Miss Marple's keen eyes, hidden behind a gentle smile, sought the truth behind the jeweler's polished exterior, for she knew that facades, like the glass in Gryce's shop windows, could conceal as much as they revealed. Her pretext for the visit was simple: a brooch, she would say, for her niece's upcoming birthday. It was the sort of errand that raised no eyebrows, yet allowed her to observe without seeming to pry. As she approached the shop, she noted its impeccable cleanliness. Windows gleamed, the brass doorknob shone, and a small bell tinkled crisply as she entered. The interior was a study in understated elegance. Glass cases displayed modest rings and pendants, their sparkle carefully curated to suggest respectability rather than opulence. Behind the counter stood Mortimer Gryce, a man of middle years, with a lean face and eyes that darted like minnows in a stream. His suit was immaculate, his teepin a subtle glint of silver, but his hands, Miss Marple noticed, betrayed a faint tremor as he adjusted a tray of earrings. "Good morning, Mr. Gryce," Miss Marple said, her voice as warm as the sunlight filtering through the shop's curtains. "I'm in need of a brooch, something simple, for a young lady. My niece, you know, has a fondness for delicate things." Gryce's smile was tight, a practiced curve that did not reach his eyes. "Of course, Miss Marple, I've just a thing, a pearl brooch, perhaps, or one with a small garnet. Let me show you." As he moved to a case, Miss Marple's gaze wandered, taking in the shop's details with the precision of a botanist examining a rare flower. A heavy safe squatted in the corner, its black iron surface unmarred by dust, its lock gleaming with recent use. On the counter lay a ledger, its pages open to a list of transactions, the handwriting meticulous but peppered with cryptic initials, V.S., J.R., C.V. among them. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained one of polite interest. She recalled a village shopkeeper who had once hidden pilfered goods in a ledger's margins, his codes as transparent to her as glass. "The garnet is lovely," she said, peering at the brooch Gryce presented, "though one hears such dreadful things about gems these days, with that theft at Lord Harrington's manor." "The Ashford sapphire, wasn't it? A jeweler like you must know its worth." Gryce's fingers paused on the brooch, his eyes flickering to hers before returning to the display. "A fine piece, no doubt," he said, his voice smooth but edged with caution. "Worth a fortune, they say, but I deal in honest trade, Miss Marple. No sapphires here, stolen or otherwise." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone as mild as milk, "though it must be tempting, handling such treasures. My late cousin's husband, a jeweler in Exeter, used to say the lure of a great gem could turn even the steadiest head." Gryce's laugh was a dry sound, like leaves skittering across pavement. "Your cousin's husband was right, but I keep my head, Miss Marple. Too many risks in that game." She nodded, her eyes drifting to the ledger again. "Such meticulous records you keep. I suppose a man in your trade must account for every transaction. Those initials V.S., for instance, might they stand for a customer?" Gryce's hand moved swiftly, closing the ledger with a snap. "Just shorthand. Miss Marple saves time. Now, about that brooch, shall I wrap it for you?" Miss Marple declined the purchase with a smile, claiming she needed time to consider. But as she turned to leave, her eyes caught a glint from behind the counter, a velvet pouch, half hidden beneath a cloth, its shape suggesting something heavier than earrings. She thought of a village grocer who had once tucked stolen coins in a flour sack, believing them safe from prying eyes. Gryce's safe, she suspected, held more than trinkets. Outside, the high street was waking fully, with villagers exchanging nods and news. Miss Marple lingered near the shop's window, pretending to admire a display while watching Gryce through the glass. He stood by the safe, his back to the street, his movements quick and furtive as he opened it and placed the pouch inside. The lock clicked shut, and he glanced toward the door, his face taut with something akin to fear. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind weaving a thread from Gryce's unease to the initials in his ledger. V.S. Victor Slade. Surely, but what business had they shared, and why was Gryce so guarded? Her walk home took her past the post office, where she encountered Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed with the morning's gossip. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, clutching a parcel. "Have you heard? They're saying Mortimer Gryce was seen near the manor the night of the theft, loitering by the gates. My maid swears he's fencing that sapphire for Slade." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her tone remained demure. "How curious, Mrs. Bantry, though one must be careful with rumors. I recall a time when the village thought old Mr. Pike was smuggling brandy, when he was merely collecting firewood." Mrs. Bantry laughed, but her eyes were sharp. "Still, Gryce is a sly one, and that Clara Vanishes been to his shop twice this week, my gardener says. Thick as thieves, those two." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. Clara's visits to Gryce's shop suggested a connection beyond mere acquaintance, perhaps a partnership turned sour. She recalled a village dressmaker who had once conspired with a peddler to sell stolen lace, their alliance crumbling under greed. As she bid Mrs. Bantry farewell, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Inspector Craddock, whose investigation seemed stalled by the lack of tangible clues. She resolved to share her observations with him, though delicately, for young men like Craddock could be prickly about unsolicited advice. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles clicking in rhythm with her thoughts. The sun warmed the roses, their scent mingling with the faint temps of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. She considered Gryce's ledger, the pouch, the scyphage, a piece of a puzzle that refused to fit neatly. Why would a fence like Gryce risk holding the sapphire, if indeed he had it? And what of Clara's visits? Were they part of a plan, or a sign of distrust? Her reverie was interrupted by Florence, who bustled out with a tray of tea and scones. "Miss, the butcher's boy says Gryce was in a right state this morning, snapping at customers and locking the shop early. Reckon he's nervous about something." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes distant. "Nervous men, Florence, are often men with secrets. Like Mr. Harrow, who hid his gambling debts behind a locked desk until his wife found the key." Florence's eyes widened. "You think Gryce is hiding the sapphire?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that Mr. Gryce is hiding something, and it may be more than a gem." As evening fell, Miss Marple attended a meeting of the Women's Institute, where talk of the theft was inescapable. She listened quietly as villagers speculated, her needles moving steadily, her mind sifting through their words. A farmer mentioned seeing Gryce's cart near the old mill the night after the theft, its wheels caked with mud. A seamstress recalled Gryce buying a heavy bolt of cloth, unusual for a man who dealt in gems, not textiles. Each snippet was a thread, and Miss Marple wove them into a pattern that pointed to Gryce as more than a bystander. Returning home, she lit her lamp and settled by the fire, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the night's stillness. Mortimer Gryce was a man of secrets, his shop a facade, as carefully crafted as his smile. The ledger's initials, the velvet pouch, the locked safe, they suggested a role in the theft, perhaps as the fence who turned on his partner. Miss Marple thought of a village baker who had once betrayed a friend for a sack of flour, his greed as plain as the crumbs on his apron. Gryce, she suspected, was driven by a similar hunger, one that might have led him to silence Victor Slade. As she set her knitting aside, Miss Marple's eyes fell on a letter from her nephew Raymond, describing a London jeweler caught selling stolen diamonds. The parallel was striking, and she resolved to visit Inspector Craddock the next day, to nudge his investigation toward Gryce's shop without seeming to interfere. The Ashford sapphire was a glittering lure, but the truth behind its theft was a darker prize, one she would uncover with the patience of a gardener tending her roses. Chapter 4. The detective's disquiet. The autumn air carried a crisp edge as Miss Jane Marple sat by her drawing-room window, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the polished floor of her cottage in St. Mary Mead. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, the needles silent for once. As her thoughts turned to Inspector Dermot Craddock, the young detective tasked with unraveling the mystery of the Ashford Sapphire's theft. His earnest demeanor at the vicarage gathering had been tempered by a restlessness that Miss Marple recognized all too well, a sign of a man wrestling with more than just a case. She had seen it before, in a village schoolmaster whose zeal to solve a petty theft had masked a deeper personal turmoil. Craddock, she suspected, carried a similar burden, one that might cloud his pursuit of Victor Slade and the stolen gem. The village was abuzz with speculation, the theft a topic as inescapable as the harvest festival preparations. Miss Marple, however, preferred the quiet of her own observations. Sifting through the threads of the case like patterns in her lacework, Clara Vane's polished alibi, Mortimer Gryce's guarded facade, and the whispers of Julian Rook's envy had each added to the tapestry, but Craddock's role intrigued her most. His frustration, evident in the tight set of his jaw and the curtness of his replies at the vicarage, suggested a man under pressure only from Scotland Yard, but from something more personal, determined to learn more. Miss Marple sent a note to Craddock, inviting him for tea under the guise of sharing village gossip that might aid his investigation. He arrived promptly at 4, his suit as neat as ever, though his eyes betrayed a weariness that no amount of polish could conceal. He stood in her doorway, hat in hand, his expression a mix of courtesy and caution. "Miss Marple, it's good of you to see me," he said, stepping into the drawing room. "I hope you've not been troubled by all this talk of the theft." "Not at all, Inspector," she replied, gesturing to an armchair by the fire. "A village thrives on talk, you know, and I find it often reveals more than it intends. Do sit down. Florence has made her excellent seed cake." As Craddock settled, Miss Marple poured tea, her movements deliberate, her eyes noting the way his fingers drummed lightly on the armrest. Florence bustled in with the tray, her cheeks pink, with the thrill of serving a Scotland Yard man, and Miss Marple dismissed her with a gentle nod. The room fell quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of china. "I understand the case is proving difficult," Miss Marple began, her tone as mild as the steam rising from her cup. "A thief like Victor Slade, vanishing without a trace, it must be quite a challenge." Craddock's jaw tightened, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "It's maddening, Miss Marple." Slade's shadow slipped through the Manor's security like it was nothing. "The safe was opened without force. The guard saw no one, and there's not a single clue at the scene. It's as if he planned to disappear all along." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with interest. "Planned, you say, or perhaps compelled? I recall a village lad who vanished after a prank, only to be found hiding from his own guilt. Sometimes disappearance is not a choice, Inspector." Craddock's brow furrowed, his teacup pausing halfway to his lips. "You think Slade was forced to vanish? But why take the sapphire and then go to ground? He's got what he wanted, has he?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, her gaze steady. "A man like Slade, bold enough to taunt Scotland Yard, might not hide unless he had no other option. You mentioned a note he sent you before the theft. Quite a daring thing to do." Craddock's expression darkened, his fingers tightening on the cup. "Yes, a blasted note, delivered to my office a week before the gala. 'Catch me if you can, Inspector,' it said, with a sketch of a sapphire, mocking me, as if he knew I'd fail again." He stopped, his voice catching, and Miss Marple's heart quickened, sensing a thread she had not yet pulled. "Again?" she asked gently, her tone as unassuming as a neighbor inquiring about the weather. Craddock hesitated, his eyes flicking to the fire. "It's nothing, Miss Marple, just a case from years ago. An informant of mine, a good man, got mixed up with Slade's sort. I promised to protect him, but Slade outsmarted me. The man died, and I've carried that failure ever since." Slade's note felt personal. Miss Marple nodded, her face a mask of sympathy, though her mind was racing. Guilt, she knew, could be as blinding as fog, obscuring the clearest clues. She recalled a village curate who had overlooked a thief's tracks in his garden, too consumed by shame over a forgotten duty. Craddock's past, it seemed, was a shadow as real as Slade's disappearance. That must weigh heavily, she said, her voice soft. But guilt can sharpen the mind, too, if one lets it. Have you considered Mr. Gryce, the jeweler? I noticed a ledger in his shop, with initials that might be of interest, V.S. among them. Craddock's eyes sharpened, a spark of his professional zeal returning. Gryce, I've had my eye on him, but there's no evidence tying him to the theft. His shop's clean, his record's in order. Still, those initials, I'll look into it. Why didn't I see that ledger? Sometimes, Inspector, the obvious is the hardest to see, Miss Marple said, her smile gentle. Like Mrs. Finch, who searched for her lost brooch while wearing it on her shawl. You've been focused on Slade, but perhaps the answer lies with those around him. Craddock set down his cup, his expression a mix of gratitude and chagrin. You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. I'll check Gryce's shop tomorrow, and I'll have my men question Clara Vane again. Her alibi's solid, but there's something off about her. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the window, where the last light of day gilded the roses. Clara is a puzzle, to be sure, and Julian Rook's boasts at the pub suggest more than idle rivalry. Envy can be a powerful motive, Inspector, as I once saw in a village boy who sabotaged his friend's prize marrow out of spite. Craddock rose, his posture straighter, as if her words had lightened his burden. I'll follow up on Rook too. Thank you, Miss Marple. I confess, I wasn't sure what to expect from this visit, but you've given me a new angle. As he left, Miss Marple watched him stride down the path, his step brisker than when he arrived. She took up her knitting, the needles resuming their steady rhythm, each click a step toward clarity. Craddock's disquiet was a clue in itself, a sign that his past with Slade might blind him to subtler truths. The note, the initials, the absence of clues at the manor these pointed to a scheme more intricate than a simple theft. That evening, as she sat by her fire, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the manor's layout, which she knew from a charity tea held there last spring. The library safe, where the sapphire had been kept, was tucked behind a portrait, accessible only to those familiar with the house. Slade's skill was undeniable, but his disappearance suggested betrayal, perhaps by someone close enough to know his plans. Clara, with her lockpicking and nervous scarf-twisting, Gryce, with his safe and cryptic ledger, or Rook, whose envy might have driven him to more than words. Miss Marple's needles paused as she recalled a village scandal involving a stolen recipe book, solved when she noticed a smudge of flour on a thief's cuff. Details, she knew, were the key details, like Gryce's velvet pouch, Clara's bruise, Craddock's guilt. She resolved to visit the manor's grounds herself, to see if the scene of the crime held secrets the police had missed. Inspector Craddock, for all his diligence, needed a nudge, and Miss Marple was adept at nudging without seeming to push. As the fire dwindled, she set her knitting aside, her eyes bright with the quiet thrill of the chase. The Ashford sapphire was a glittering distraction, but the truth behind Slade's vanishing was a deeper mystery, one she would unravel with the patience of a gardener teasing apart tangled roots. St. Mary Mead, for all its sleepy charm, was a stage where human nature played out its dramas, and Miss Marple was its keenest observer. Chapter 5. The Rival's Resentment. The autumn leaves in St. Mary Mead drifted lazily to the ground, painting the village lanes in hues of amber and crimson, as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the Green Man, the local pub where gossip flowed as freely as the ale. Her shawl was pinned neatly at her shoulder, her hat adorned with a single feather that bobbed with her measured steps. The theft of the Ashford sapphire had woven a web of suspicion across the village, and Julian Rook, the rival thief whose name peppered the villagers' chatter, was a thread Miss Marple was eager to tug. His loud boasts at the pub, reported by Florence with wide-eyed relish, suggested a man whose envy of Victor Slade might have spurred him to action. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as the autumn air, knew that envy, like a weed, could choke even the most careful plans. The Green Man was a sturdy building of weathered stone, its windows aglow with the warmth of lamplight as dusk settled over the village. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hops and the hum of conversation. Miss Marple, under the pretense of meeting Mrs. Bantry for a sherry, took a seat near the bar, her eyes scanning the room with the unobtrusive curiosity of one accustomed to seeing without being seen. Julian Rook was there, as expected, leaning against a wooden beam, his lean frame clad in a worn jacket, his fox-like grin fixed on a group of farmhands, who listened to his tales with wary amusement. Slade thought himself the king of thieves, Rook was saying, his voice carrying over the clink of glasses. But he's not so clever now, is he? Vanished with that sapphire, likely sipping champagne in Paris while we're all left to speculate. I'd have done it cleaner left, no trace, no fuss. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her knitting bag resting on the table before her, though she made no move to open it. Rook's words were bold, but his eyes darted about the room, as if seeking approval or guarding against eavesdroppers. She recalled a village lad, years ago, who had boasted of stealing apples to mask his fear of being caught. Rook's bravado, she suspected, hid a deeper truth, perhaps a role in Slade's disappearance. Mrs. Bantry arrived, her cheeks flushed from the evening chill, and settled beside Miss Marple with a theatrical sigh. "Jane, this theft has everyone in a tizzy. I heard Rook at the market this morning, going on about how he'd outsmarted Slade once before. The man's positively green with envy." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes still on Rook. "Envy is a curious thing, Dolly. It can make a man boast, or it can make him act. I remember young Tommy Pierce, who ruined his rival's bicycle out of spite. I wonder what Mr. Rook might do to prove himself better than Slade." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, but before she could reply, Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate, and approached the bar under the guise of ordering another sherry. Rook, catching sight of her, straightened, his grin faltering for a moment before he recovered. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping an imaginary hat. "Didn't expect to see you in a place like this. Come to hear the village news." "News travels fast in St. Mary Mead," she replied, her voice as gentle as the lamplight, "and you seem to have plenty to share. Mr. Rook, I heard you speaking of Victor Slade's, such a bold man, to steal the Ashford sapphire. You must have known him well, to speak so confidently of his ways." Rook's grin returned, though his eyes were wary. "Knew him enough to know he's not half as clever as he thinks. Always flashing his charm, making promises he couldn't keep. I crossed paths with him in Dannemouth, a few times, petty jobs. Nothing like the sapphire. He got lucky, that's all." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Lucky, you say? Yet he's vanished, which seems less fortunate. I understand you were in a neighboring town during the gala playing cards, was it? My nephew Raymond enjoys a game, but he says it's hard to find honest players." Rook's fingers tightened on his glass, his grin thinning. "Cards and chipping Cleghorn, a friendly game, nothing more. Ask anyone there. Well, it was late, and the pub was dark, but I was there, right enough." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to Rook's boots, caked with mud that matched the rich, loamy soil of Lord Harrington's estate. She recalled a poacher from her youth, whose muddy boots had betrayed his nocturnal wanderings. "Such a pity about the weather," she said, her tone conversational. "All this mud about makes it hard to keep one's shoes clean, doesn't it? The manor grounds must be quite a mess after the gala." Rook's gaze flicked to his boots, and he shifted his weight, his laugh a touch too loud. "Mud's everywhere this time of year. Miss Marple can't avoid it, living in the country." "Of course," she said, her smile as soft as the sherry in her glass. Though one does wonder where a man might tread to gather such specific mud. The manor's soil is quite distinctive, I'm told. Rook's grin faded, and he drained his ale, muttering an excuse about meeting a friend. As he slipped out into the night, Miss Marple returned to her table, her mind weaving a pattern from his words and demeanor. His vague alibi, his muddy boots, his quick deflection, they were threads in a tapestry of resentment, one that might have led him to the manor on the night of the theft. Mrs. Bantry, sipping her sherry, leaned close. "Jane, you've got that look, the one you had when you caught the vicar's nephew pilfering the collection plate. What's Rook hiding?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her voice remained demure. "Hiding, Dolly. Perhaps nothing more than a bruised ego, but envy can be a dangerous thing. I recall a village girl who sabotaged her rival's sewing to win a competition. Mr. Rook's dislike of Slade seems personal." As they left the pub, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the lane where Rook had disappeared, his figure swallowed by the shadows. She thought of Inspector Craddock, whose guilt over a past failure might blind him to Rook's role. She resolved to share her observations with him, though gently, for men like Craddock preferred to believe they led their own inquiries. The muddy boots, in particular, warranted attention. Mud, she knew, could tell a story as clearly as a confession. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by her fire, her knitting needles resuming their steady click. The room was warm, the scent of lavender from a bowl on the mantel mingling with the faint smokiness of the hearth. She considered Rook's place in the puzzle, his envy a motive as potent as Clara's secrets or Grice's greed. Had he followed Slade to the manor, hoping to steal his thunder? Or had his resentment driven him further, to a darker act? She recalled a village feud where a farmer's jealousy had led to a stolen plow, hidden in a barn to spite his neighbor. Rook's boasts, his muddy boots, his vague alibi, they suggested he was more than a bystander, perhaps a shadow trailing Slade through the night. The manor's grounds, she decided, must hold more clues, and she would urge Craddock to search them, perhaps with a keener eye for what lay beneath the surface. As the clock struck 9, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her thoughts as clear as the stars beyond her window. Julian Rook was a man driven by resentment, his words a mask for deeper intentions. The Ashford sapphire was a glittering prize, but the truth of its theft and Slade's vanishing was a knot she would untangle, one careful thread at a time, in the quiet heart of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 6. A clue. In the garden, the morning sun filtered through the ancient oaks of Lord Harrington's estate, casting dappled light across the manicured lawns of St. Mary Mead's grandest manor. Miss Jane Marple, her sensible shoes crunching softly on the gravel path, approached the estate with a basket of roses, ostensibly gathered for Lady Harrington's charity bazaar. Her true purpose, however, was to examine the grounds where the Ashford sapphire had been stolen, for she knew that crime scenes like village gossip often held secrets overlooked by hastier eyes. The manor's serenity belied the audacity of Victor Slade's theft, and Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as the shears in her basket, sought the subtle traces he or his betrayer might have left behind. She had secured Lord Harrington's permission for her visit with a charming note, citing her interest in the estate's gardens, renowned for their rare shrubs. The lord, a genial man with a weakness for flattery, had readily agreed, unaware that Miss Marple's green fingers were matched by an even keener instinct for detection. As she entered the grounds, she nodded politely to a young constable stationed near the gate, his bored expression suggesting he found the assignment tedious. Miss Marple's smile was disarming, her presence as unthreatening as the roses she carried. Yet her eyes missed nothing: the trampled grass near the servants' entrance, the faint scuff marks on a stone step, the hedge that bordered the path to the library where the sapphire had been kept. The manor's gardens were a marvel, with rose beds framed by boxwood and a gravel walk leading to a secluded arbor. Miss Marple paused by the library's exterior wall, where tall windows overlooked the lawn. The safe, she recalled from her last visit, was hidden behind a portrait of Lord Harrington's grandfather, accessible only to those familiar with the house's secrets. Victor Slade, with his reputed cunning, would have known the layout, but his disappearance suggested a plan gone awry. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a village burglary years ago, when a thief's escape was foiled by a single overlooked Attila broken twig that pointed to his hiding place. As she strolled toward the servants' entrance, her eyes caught a glimmer in the hedge scrap of fabric, no larger than a child's handkerchief, snagged on a thorn. She bent closer, her fingers careful not to disturb it. The fabric was silk, dyed a deep indigo, its edges frayed as if torn. In haste, Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. The color was striking, reminiscent of a scarf Clara Vane had worn at the vicarage, though not the scarlet one from their tea. She recalled a village girl who had lost a ribbon while sneaking through a garden, the scrap leading to her confession. Tucking the observation away, Miss Marple continued her walk, her eyes scanning the ground for further clues. Near the hedge, the earth was uneven, a patch of soil disturbed as if someone had trodden heavily or scraped it with a tool. She knelt, her basket set aside, and brushed the dirt with her fingers, revealing a faint outline that suggested digging. Not deep, but deliberate, as if something had been hastily buried and covered. Miss Marple straightened, her mind racing. The manor's grounds had been searched by Inspector Craddock's men, yet this spot, tucked behind the hedge, seemed overlooked. She thought of a village gardener who had buried stolen tools in his plot, believing them safe from prying eyes. Determined to test her suspicion, Miss Marple returned to the constable, her tone as mild as the morning breeze. "Young man, might you fetch Inspector Craddock? I found something in the garden that may interest him. Nothing alarming, mind you. Just a trifle that caught my eye." The constable, startled by her request, but swayed by her grandmotherly demeanor, hurried off. Miss Marple waited, her eyes fixed on the disturbed earth, her thoughts weaving a pattern from the silk scrap and the hidden soil. When Craddock arrived, his face a mix of curiosity and exasperation, she led him to the spot, pointing with her parasol. "Inspector, this patch of ground seems unsettled," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And that bit of silk in the hedge quite unusual, don't you think? I recall a case in the village where a torn glove led to a thief's undoing." Craddock knelt, his brow furrowing as he examined the soil. "You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple. This does look disturbed, and the silk out for a garden." He called for a spade, and a constable began to dig, the earth yielding easily under the blade. After a moment, the spade struck something solid, a broken shovel. Its handle splintered, its blade caked with dirt that matched the manor's loamy soil. Craddock's eyes narrowed. A shovel, buried here. Why hide a broken tool? Miss Marple, lips pursed, her gaze steady. "Perhaps, Inspector, it was used for something other than gardening. I once knew a man who buried a hammer to conceal its use in a theft. The handle's break suggests force or haste." Craddock ordered the area cordoned off, his men searching for further evidence, but the ground yielded nothing more. The silk scrap was bagged, the shovel taken for examination, and Miss Marple watched, her mind turning over the clues. The indigo fabric pointed to Clara Vane, whose lock-picking skills and nervous demeanor suggested a deeper role in the theft. Yet the shovel's burial hinted at a cover-up, perhaps by someone desperate to erase their tracks. Mortimer Gryce's guarded safe and Julian Rook's muddy boots flickered in her thoughts, each a thread in a tapestry still incomplete. As she left the manor, Miss Marple paused to thank Lord Harrington, who was overseeing preparations for the bazaar. "Such a lovely garden," she said, her tone warm, though one does wonder how a shovel came to be buried by the hedge. Servants can be so careless, can't they? Lord Harrington chuckled, unaware of her probing. Careless indeed, Miss Marple. Though with all this theft business, I dare say it's more than a servant's doing. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by her fire, her knitting needles clicking in rhythm with her thoughts. The silk scrap and the shovel were clues, as tangible as the roses in her basket, yet their meaning remained elusive. Had Clara been at the manor, her scarf torn in a struggle? Or had someone else, Grice, perhaps, or Rook, used the shovel to hide a darker deed? She recalled a village scandal where a buried locket had revealed a thief's betrayal. The act as telling as the crime itself. Miss Marple resolved to share her findings with Craddock, though she would frame them as mere observations, for young men like him preferred to believe they led the chase. The indigo silk, she suspected, would lead to Clara. But the shovel pointed elsewhere, perhaps to Grice, whose shop held secrets, or Rook, whose envy might have driven him to the grounds. As the fire crackled, she set her knitting aside, her eyes bright with the quiet thrill of a puzzle taking shape. The Ashford sapphire was a glittering lure, but the truth of Victor Slade's fate lay in the shadows of St. Mary Mead, waiting for her patient hand to bring it to light. Chapter 7. The Fence's Secret. The early evening light bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, softening the edges of its thatched cottages. As Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing-room, her knitting needles paused mid-stitch. The discovery of the indigo silk and buried shovel in Lord Harrington's garden had sharpened her focus on Mortimer Grice, the jeweler whose guarded demeanor and cryptic ledger hinted at a role far beyond that of a village tradesman. The whispers of his dealings in stolen goods, coupled with the initials V's in his ledger, wove a thread of suspicion that Miss Marple was determined to follow. She knew that secrets, like weeds, thrived in hidden corners, and Grice's shop was a corner she intended to explore. Her plan required subtlety, for direct confrontation would only tighten Grice's defenses. Instead, she enlisted Florence, her maid, whose guileless chatter and knack for blending into the village's daily hum made her the perfect emissary. Miss Marple summoned Florence to the drawing-room, her voice as gentle as the ticking of the mantel clock. "Florence, my dear," she began, setting her knitting aside. "I wonder if you might run an errand for me. I've been thinking of having a family heirloom valued a locket. Nothing grand, but it would do to visit Mr. Grice's shop. You're so good with people, and I'm sure you'd notice anything." Out of the ordinary, Florence's eyes widened, her hands twisting in her apron. "You mean the sapphire, miss? You think Grice has it hidden away?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, her eyes twinkling with quiet purpose. "I think, Florence, that Mr. Grice's shop holds more than meets the eye, like Mrs. Harrow's pantry, which concealed a stolen jar of preserves until her maid spotted the label. Just keep your eyes open, my dear, and tell me everything." Florence, thrilled by the prospect of detective work, set off for Grice's shop the next morning, armed with a tarnished locket and a story about her aunt's inheritance. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained in her garden, tending her roses with a care that belied the sharpness of her thoughts. She recalled a village baker who had hidden pilfered coins in a flour tin, his secret betrayed by a smudge of dough. Grice, she suspected, was similarly careless, his greed leaving traces for those who knew where to look. At noon, Florence returned, her cheeks flushed with excitement, as she burst into the cottage. "Oh, miss, you'll never believe it. I did as you said, and while Grice was fussing over the locket, I saw something in his shop, a velvet pouch, tucked behind a tray of rings. It was heavy, miss, and when he moved it, I swear I saw a flash of blue, like a gem." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her expression serene though her mind raced. "A blue flash, you say? How very interesting. Did Mr. Grice seem anxious, perhaps? Anxious as a cat in a rainstorm, miss." He kept glancing at the safe, and when I asked about a sapphire brooch just to see what he'd say, he near dropped the locket. said he didn't deal in sapphires, but his hands were shaking something awful. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the roses beyond her window. A velvet pouch, a flash of blue, a nervous jeweler, these were threads that pointed to Grice, as more than a bystander. She recalled a village grocer who had fenced stolen silver, his unease betraying him when questioned too closely. Grice's safe, she suspected, held the Ashford sapphire, or something equally damning, and his connection to Victor Slade was no mere coincidence. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple decided to visit Inspector Craddock, framing her visit as a courtesy rather than a nudge. She found him at the village hall, where he was reviewing reports with a harried air. His desk was strewn with papers, his brow furrowed as he scribbled notes about the manor's search. Miss Marple approached, her basket of roses a disarming prop, her smile as warm as the afternoon sun. "Inspector Craddock," she said, her voice soft, "I hope I'm not interrupting. I was passing by and thought you might appreciate a few roses for your office. Such a trying case. This theft." Craddock looked up, a flicker of relief in his tired eyes. "Miss Marple, you're too kind. These reports are driving me mad." Trace of Slade. No sign of the sapphire. "That shovel you found was a help, but it's led nowhere so far." Miss Marple set the roses on his desk, her gaze lingering on a map of the manor's grounds. "A puzzle, to be sure. I was thinking of Mr. Grice's shop, such a tidy place, but one does hear whispers. My maid mentioned a pouch in his shop, with a hint of blue. I thought of Mrs. Carter, who found stolen coins in a shopkeeper's drawer, hidden in plain sight." Craddock's eyes sharpened, his pen pausing. "A pouch, blue, you say? Grice has been on my list, but his shop's clean as a whistle. Still, that ledger you mentioned and, now this pouch. I'll get a warrant to search his premises." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle encouragement. "A search might be wise, Inspector. Men like Grice are careful, but carelessness creeps in when greed is involved. I recall a village tailor who hid stolen cloth in his workroom, thinking no one would look twice." Craddock rose, his posture brisker, as if her words had rekindled his resolve. "I'll have my men on it by morning, Miss Marple. If Grice has that sapphire, I'll find it. Thank you, your insights are uncanny." As she left the hall, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the web of connections binding Grice to Slade. The initials in the ledger, the velvet pouch, the buried shovel, they suggested a betrayal. Perhaps a fence who had grown greedy for the prize he was meant to sell. She recalled a village scandal where a farmer had double-crossed his partner over a stolen calf, hiding it in his barn until the truth came out. Grice, she suspected, had a similar motive, one that might explain Slade's vanishing. That evening, as she sat by her fire, Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked in rhythm with her thoughts. The indigo silk pointed to Claravane, but the shovel in the pouch turned her gaze to Grice. Had he lured Slade into a trap, seeking the sapphire for himself? Or was there another player, perhaps Julian Rook, whose muddy boots placed him near the manor? The threads were multiplying, each one a clue to a darker truth. She thought of Inspector Craddock, whose guilt over a past failure might still cloud his judgment. The search of Grice's shop would be crucial, but she would need to keep a close eye on Clara and Rook, for their roles were far from clear. As the firelight danced on her needles, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. The Ashford sapphire was a glittering distraction, but the secret of Victor Slade's fate lay in the shadows of St. Mary Mead, waiting for her patient hand to unravel its knots. Chapter 8. The accomplice's confession. The soft glow of lamplight spilled from the windows of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting a warm halo against the twilight chill of St. Mary Mead. Inside, her drawing room was a haven of quiet order, the fire crackling gently as her knitting needles lay idle on the table, a rare pause in their rhythmic dance. The discovery of the indigo silk and the buried shovel in Lord Harrington's garden coupled with Florence's glimpse of a velvet pouch in Mortimer Gryce's shop, had tightened the threads of suspicion around Clara Vane. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the autumn frost, turned to the auburn-haired accomplice, whose polished alibi and nervous gestures suggested a story yet untold. Clara's connection to Victor Slade was undeniable, but the nature of her role, whether pawn or player, remained a puzzle Miss Marple was determined to solve. The morning had brought a fresh wave of village gossip, with Florence reporting that Clara had been seen pacing the lane near her cottage, her face pale and her scarf a new one, green as emerald, twisted tightly in her hands. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the nuances of human behavior, recognized the signs of a soul under strain. She recalled a village seamstress who had paced the churchyard before confessing to a petty theft, her guilt unraveling like a poorly stitched hem. Clara, she suspected, was nearing a similar breaking point, and a gentle nudge might loosen the truth. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple invited Clara to her cottage under the pretext of discussing the Women's Institute's upcoming bazaar. She penned a note, her handwriting as neat as her thoughts, and sent Florence to deliver it. Clara arrived promptly at 3, her elegance undimmed despite the shadows beneath her eyes. Her green scarf was knotted loosely, her auburn hair swept into a chignon, but her fingers betrayed her unease. Fidgeting with a silver bracelet as she stepped into the drawing room, "Miss Marple, how kind of you to invite me," Clara said, her voice bright but brittle, like glass on the verge of cracking. "I'm afraid I'm not much use for bazaar planning, but I'm happy to help." Miss Marple smiled, gesturing to an armchair by the fire. "Nonsense, my dear. A fresh perspective is always welcome. And besides, I thought a chat might do us both good, with all this talk of the theft unsettling the village." "Tea?" Clara nodded, settling into the chair as Miss Marple poured from a china pot, the steam curling like a question mark. Florence had outdone herself with a tray of scones and clotted cream, and Miss Marple noted Clara's hesitation before accepting one, as if appetite were a luxury she could not afford. The room was quiet, save for the fire's soft pop and the distant chime of the church clock, and Miss Marple let the silence linger, knowing it could be as probing as any question. "The Ashford sapphire has caused quite a stir," she began, her tone conversational. "I hear you knew Victor Slade well, my dear. Such a bold man, to vanish with such a prize, though one does wonder where he's gone." Clara's fingers tightened on her bracelet, her eyes flicking to the window. "Victor? Oh, we were acquaintances, nothing more. He was charming, in his way, but unreliable. I haven't seen him since, well, before the gala." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her gaze was as keen as a hawk's. "Before the gala, you say? I heard you were to meet him afterward, at the old mill perhaps. My nephew Raymond once planned a rendezvous there, but the place is so dreadfully isolated. Not a spot for a lady, I'd think." Clara's face paled, her bracelet slipping from her fingers to clatter on the table. She retrieved it hastily, her laugh a thin, nervous sound. "The mill? No, I never went there. I was in London, as I told everyone, dining with Mr. Lang, the producer. I've the ticket stub, the waiter's word, of course," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as the firelight. "Though alibis can be such fragile things, can't they? Like Mrs. Finch's story about her lost brooch, which turned up in her own pocket. I couldn't help noticing a scrap of silk in Lord Harrington's garden indigo, quite like one of your scarves. And that bruise on your wrist, my dear, it looks painful." Clara's hand flew to her wrist, her green scarf slipping to reveal the faint purple mark Miss Marple had glimpsed before. Her eyes, wide with panic, met Miss Marple's, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, like a dam breaking, Clara's composure crumbled, her shoulders sagging as tears welled. "Oh, Miss Marple, I can't bear it any more," she sobbed, her voice raw. I did help Victor plan the theft. I picked the lock on the safe, showed him the manners layout, but I swear I didn't take the sapphire. He was supposed to meet me at the mill afterward to split the profits, but he never came. I waited hours, alone in the dark, and when I went back to the manor to look for him, I tore my scarf on the hedge. I didn't know what to do. Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression one of quiet sympathy, though her mind was racing. There, my dear. The truth is always a relief, isn't it? Like Mrs. Carter, who confessed to stealing a pie and felt lighter for it. What happened at the mill, Clara? Did you see anyone else? Clara shook her head, her tears falling freely. No one, I swear. But I heard footsteps, heavy ones, and I ran. I thought Victor had betrayed me, taken the sapphire for himself. But now I'm afraid something's happened to him. He's not the sort to vanish without a word. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the fire as she pieced together Clara's confession. The indigo silk, the mill, the bruise, they painted a picture of a woman caught in a scheme larger than she'd anticipated. Yet the heavy footsteps suggested another presence, perhaps Mortimer Gryce, whose pouch hinted at possession of the sapphire, or Julian Rook, whose muddy boots placed him near the manor. She recalled a village scandal, where a girl's confession had revealed only half the truth, the rest hidden in another's silence. "You've been very brave, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "But tell me, did you ever visit Mr. Gryce's shop after the theft? I hear you've been seen there, and he's a man with secrets, I think." Clara's eyes widened, her tears slowing. "Gryce. I went to ask if he'd heard from Victor. We both knew him, you see. But Gryce was strange, cagey, said he didn't deal in sapphires. I didn't trust him. He's always been greedy, wanting more than his share." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her thoughts weaving a new thread. Clara's visits to Gryce, her fear for Slade, the footsteps at the mill, they pointed to a betrayal, perhaps by the jeweler who saw a chance to claim the sapphire for himself. She recalled a village butcher who had double-crossed a partner over stolen meat, his greed as clear as the blood on his apron. As Clara dried her eyes, Miss Marple offered her another scone, her smile warm but her mind cold with calculation. "You mustn't worry, my dear. The truth has a way of coming out, like a weed in a garden. I'll speak to Inspector Craddock. He's a good man, and he'll know what to do." Clara left, her step lighter but her face still drawn, and Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting needles resuming their click. Clara's confession was a vital thread, but it raised new questions. The mill, isolated and shadowy, was a perfect stage for treachery, and the footsteps suggested a third player, Gryce, Rook, or someone yet unknown. She resolved to urge Craddock to search the mill, for its secrets might hold the key to Slade's fate. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the tapestry of motives binding the suspects. Clara's lock, picking Gryce's pouch, Rook's envy, Craddock's guilt. Each was a piece of a puzzle that refused to fit neatly. She recalled a village feud where a stolen locket had revealed a deeper crime, its discovery as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. The Ashford sapphire was a glittering lure, but the truth of Victor Slade's disappearance lay in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead, waiting for her patient hand to bring it to light. Chapter 9. The Rival's Revelation. The dusk settled over St. Mary Mead like a soft veil. The village lanes hushed, save for the occasional rustle of leaves skittering across the cobblestones. Miss Jane Marple sat by her drawing-room window, the firelight casting a warm glow on her knitting, though her needles lay still, her thoughts far from the wool in her lap. Clara Vane's tearful confession had woven a vivid thread into the tapestry of the Ashford sapphire's theft, pointing to a fateful meeting at the old mill where Victor Slade had failed to appear. Yet Clara's mention of heavy footsteps in the night suggested another presence, and Miss Marple's mind turned to Julian Rook. the rival thief whose envy of Slade burned as brightly as the autumn foliage. His muddy boots and vague alibi, coupled with his boasts at the Green Man, marked him as a figure worth closer scrutiny. Miss Marple knew that envy, like a thorn, could prick a man into reckless action. She recalled a village carpenter who had sabotaged a rival's work out of spite, his resentment leaving traces as clear as sawdust. Rook's loud claims of superiority over Slade hinted at a deeper involvement, and Miss Marple resolved to draw him out, to test whether his bravado masked guilt or merely bluster. A direct approach would only make him wary, so she devised a subtler plan, enlisting Inspector Craddock's authority to apply pressure while she observed from the shadows. She sent a note to Craddock, suggesting he question Rook about his whereabouts during the gala, mentioning the muddy boots as a casual observation from her pub visit. Craddock, grateful for her insights but eager to maintain control, agreed to summon Rook to the village hall for an interview. Miss Marple, under the pretext of delivering a knitted shawl for the bazaar, positioned herself in the hall's anteroom, her presence unremarkable among the bustle of volunteers. Her knitting bag at her side, she settled near an open door, her ears attuned to the conversation within. Craddock's voice was firm, tinged with the impatience of a man chasing a ghost. "Mr. Rook, your story about the card game in Chipping Cleghorn doesn't hold up. No one at the pub recalls you clearly, and the timing's vague at best. You were heard boasting about outdoing Slade. Care to explain that?" Rook's reply was laced with his usual bravado, though Miss Marple caught a tremor beneath it. "I told you, Inspector, I was playing cards, having a laugh. As for Slade, I just said I'd have done the job, better cleaner, no mess. He's the one who botched it, vanishing like a coward." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her fingers brushing the wool in her bag as she listened. Rook's tone was defiant, but his choice of words, no mess, struck her as oddly specific. She recalled a village boy who had boasted of a prank to deflect suspicion, his words betraying more than he intended. Craddock pressed on, his voice sharpening. "Boasting's one thing, Rook, but we've got evidence placing you near the manor. Mud on your boots matches the estate's soil. Care to explain why you were there, if you were in Chipping Cleghorn?" There was a pause, heavy as the silence before a storm. Miss Marple leaned closer, her knitting forgotten, her eyes bright with anticipation. Rook's laugh was forced, a bark that echoed in the small room. "Mud? You're chasing mud now, Inspector. I walk all over, picking up dirt, everywhere. Doesn't mean I was at the manor." But Craddock, emboldened by Miss Marple's nudge, was unrelenting. "Then let's talk about what you saw, Rook. You're a thief, same as Slade. You know his tricks. If you were near the manor, spying on him, you might have seen something useful, or are you hiding more than mud?" The air in the hall seemed to thicken, and Miss Marple held her breath, sensing a crack in Rook's facade. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, stripped of its usual swagger. "All right, Inspector, I'll give you something. I was near the manor that night, not stealing, mind you, just watching. Slade was always lording it over me, and I wanted to see him slip up. I saw him leave the library, moving fast toward the mill, but he wasn't alone. Someone followed him, cloaked, moving like they didn't want to be seen. I didn't stick around to find out who." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. A cloaked figure Mrs. Clements, sighting near Clara's cottage, came to mind, as did the heavy footsteps Clara had heard at the mill. Rook's revelation was a vital thread, pointing to a third player in the night's drama. She recalled a village feud where a witness's half-truth had unraveled a theft, the rest emerging only under pressure. Rook, she suspected, knew more than he admitted, but his fear of implicating himself kept him guarded. Craddock's voice grew sharper, a cloaked figure. "Convenient, Rook, but then, you expect me to believe you saw nothing else? No face? No details? If you're lying to save your own skin, I'm not lying," Rook snapped, his voice rising. "I didn't see their face, and I didn't follow. I'm no fool, Slades. Games are too rich for my blood. That's all I've got, Inspector. Lock me up if you want, but I didn't take the sapphire. Craddock dismissed him with a warning to stay in the village, and Miss Marple heard the scrape of a chair as Rook left, his steps quick and uneven. She gathered her shawl, her knitting bag a prop of innocence, and stepped into the hall as if by chance, nodding to Craddock with a gentle smile. Inspector, I couldn't help overhearing, she said, her tone apologetic. Mr. Rook's story about the cloaked figure is most intriguing. It reminds me of a village poacher who was seen skulking in a cloak, only to be caught when his shadow betrayed him. Have you searched the mill yet? Clara mentioned it as a meeting place. Craddock rubbed his temples, his frustration evident. The mill's on my list, Miss Marple, but we've been focused on the manor. Rook's story could be a dodge, but that mud on his boots, he was there. All right, I'll send men to the mill tomorrow. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the window where the village lights twinkled against the gathering dark. A wise move, Inspector. Shadows leave traces, you know, even cloaked ones. I recall a case where a single footprint solved a mystery, though it took a keen eye to find it. As she walked home, the evening air sharp with the scent of wood smoke, Miss Marple's thoughts wove a pattern from Rook's revelation. His presence at the manor confirmed her suspicions, but the cloaked figure introduced a new mystery. Was it Grice, hiding the sapphire in his shop, or someone else, lurking in the shadows of Slade's scheme? Clara's footsteps at the mill, the indigo silk, the buried shovel all pointed to a betrayal, but Rook's story suggested a larger web, one spun with care and cunning. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting needles resuming their soft click. The room was warm, the scent of lavender mingling with the faint crackle of burning logs. Rook's envy was a motive as clear as Clara's guilt or Grice's greed, but his revelation shifted the puzzle's shape. The cloaked figure, she mused, was the key, a shadow that tied the threads together. She recalled a village scandal where a witness's glimpse of a hooded figure had led to a thief's capture, the truth emerging from the smallest detail. As the clock chimed, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes bright with resolve. She would urge Craddock to search the mill thoroughly, for its isolation made it a perfect stage for treachery. The Ashford sapphire was a glittering prize, but the truth of Victor Slade's fate lay in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead, waiting for her patient hand to unravel its secrets. Chapter 10. The detectives doubt. The soft patter of rain against the windows of Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead lent a somber rhythm to the morning, as if the village itself were whispering secrets of the Ashford sapphires. Theft. Miss Marple sat by her fire, a cup of tea cooling on the table, her knitting needles silent as she pondered the threads of the case. Julian Rook's revelation of a cloaked figure trailing Victor Slade toward the old mill had added a new layer to the mystery, but it was Inspector Dermot Craddock's troubled demeanor that now occupied her thoughts. His guilt over a past failure, confessed during their tea, suggested a vulnerability that might blind him to crucial clues. Miss Marple, her mind as precise as the stitches in her lacework, knew that doubt could be as paralyzing as deceit, and she resolved to guide Craddock toward clarity without bruising his pride. The village was subdued under the gray drizzle, its lanes slick with fallen leaves, as Miss Marple donned her raincoat and hat, a modest affair with a single damp feather, and set out for the village hall. She carried a basket of apples from her garden, a pretext for visiting Craddock, under the guise of sharing her harvest. The hall was a hive of activity, with constables sorting reports, and volunteers bustling about for the upcoming bazaar. Craddock sat at a desk cluttered with maps and notes, his face etched with the strain of a case that refused to yield. His suit was as neat as ever, but his eyes held a shadow that Miss Marple recognized, a mirror of the village curate, who had once faltered under the weight of a forgotten duty. "Inspector Craddock," she said, her voice as warm as the apples in her basket, "I thought you might enjoy a few of my Cox's orange pippin." A case like this must be taxing, and a bit of fruit can lift the spirits. Craddock managed a tired smile, rising to take the basket. You're too kind, Miss Marple. These will be a treat. I'm afraid the case is wearing me thin. No sign of Slade, and the mill search is set for this afternoon, thanks to your nudge about Rook's story. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her eyes soft but searching. The mill is a promising lead, Inspector. That cloaked figure Mr. Rook mentioned, it's curious, don't you think? I recall a village poacher whose cloak was his undoing, caught in a bramble for all to see. But you seem troubled, my dear man. Is it the case, or something more? Craddock's fingers paused on a report, his jaw tightening. He glanced around, ensuring no constables were within earshot, then leaned forward, his voice low. You see too much, Miss Marple. It's not just the case. That note Slade sent me's personal. Years ago, I worked a case in London. An informant named Danny Cole. Good lad, got mixed up with Slade's crew. I promised to keep him safe, but Slade outsmarted me. Danny was killed, and I've carried that ever since. Now Slade's mocking me again, and I'm afraid I'm missing something obvious. Miss Marple's expression was one of gentle sympathy, though her mind was as sharp as the rain tapping the window. Guilt is a heavy burden, Inspector, but it can sharpen the mind if you let it. Like Mr. Harrow, who overlooked the thief's tracks because he blamed himself for a lost bet. You're looking for Slade, but perhaps the answer lies with those around him. Clara, Grice, Rook. That ledger in Grice's shop. For instance, have you searched it yet? Craddock's eyes widened, a spark of realization breaking through his fatigue. The ledger, damn it. I meant to follow up after you mentioned it, but I got caught up with the manor search. You're right, Miss Marple. I've been so focused on Slade's taunt that I've let details slip. I'll have Grice's shop searched today, ledger and all. Miss Marple nodded, her smile encouraging. A wise move, Inspector. Men like Grice hide their secrets in plain sight, like Mrs. Finch's brooch, pinned to her own shawl. And the mill don't overlook its shadows. Clara heard footsteps there, and Rook saw a cloaked figure. Shadows leave traces, you know. Craddock rose, his posture straighter, as if her words had lifted a weight. I'll get to the mill this afternoon, and Grice's shop by evening. You've a knack for this, Miss Marple, pointing out what's right under my nose. I don't know how you do it. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her tone remained demure. Oh, it's just a matter of watching people, Inspector. They're much the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or London, like young Tommy Pierce, who hid his mischief behind a bold front until a single clue gave him away. As she left the hall, the rain had softened to a mist, cloaking the village in a silvery haze. Miss Marple's thoughts wove a pattern from Craddock's confession and the clues at hand. His guilt over Danny Cole explained his fixation on Slade, but it also risked blinding him to the roles of Clara, Grice, and Rook, the cloaked figure at the mill, the indigo silk, the buried shovel, the velvet pouch in Grice's shop. These were threads of a betrayal, one that might have silenced Slade to secure the sapphire. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, the scent of apples mingling with the warmth of burning logs. She took up her knitting, the needles clicking in rhythm with her thoughts. Craddock's doubt was a hurdle, but his renewed focus on Grice's shop and the mill was promising. She recalled a village scandal where a farmer's guilt over a lost crop had clouded his judgment, only for a neighbor's observation to reveal the truth. Craddock, she hoped, would find clarity in action, guided by the clues she had gently placed in his path. As the rain drummed softly, Miss Marple's mind turned to the mill, its isolation a perfect stage for treachery. The cloaked figure suggested a calculated move, perhaps by Grice, whose greed might have led him to betray Slade, or Rook, whose envy could have driven him to violence. Clara's role, too, remained ambiguous. Her confession cleared her of theft, but not of complicity. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes bright with the quiet thrill of a puzzle nearing resolution. The Ashford sapphire was a glittering lure, but the truth of Victor Slade's fate lay in the shadows of St. Mary Mead, waiting for her patient hand to draw it into the light. Chapter 11. The Trap at the Mill. The twilight draped St. Mary Mead in a cloak of mist. The village lay silent save for the faint drip of rain from overhanging eaves. Miss Jane Marple sat by her fire, the glow casting shadows that danced like the threads of suspicion weaving through her mind. Inspector Craddock's renewed resolve to search Mortimer Gryce's shop and the old mill had set the stage for a breakthrough. But Miss Marple knew that truth, like a shy flower, often needed coaxing to bloom. Clara Vane's confession, Julian Rook's revelation of a cloaked figure, and the tantalizing glimpse of a velvet pouch in Gryce's shop pointed to a betrayal at the heart of the Ashford sapphire's theft. Yet the mill, with its isolated ruin and whispered footsteps, held a secret Miss Marple was determined to uncover. She devised a plan as delicate as her finest lace, one that would draw the guilty into the open without endangering the innocent. Knowing that Gryce's greed and Rook's envy made them wary, she turned to the village's greatest ally, gossip. Miss Marple summoned Florence, her maid, whose knack for spreading news rivaled the speed of the church bell's chime. "Florence," she said, her voice soft but purposeful, "I need you to share a little story at the post office tomorrow. Say you overheard Clara Vane mention finding Victor Slade's hiding place at the old mill. Nothing certain. Mind you, just a whisper she let slip. Let it spread, as gossip does." Florence's eyes gleamed, her hands twisting in her apron with excitement. "Oh, miss, that's clever. You think it'll flush out the thief?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, her eyes twinkling. "I think, my dear, that a guilty conscience is like a startled bird. It flies when disturbed, like Mr. Pike, who confessed to stealing apples after a rumor reached his ears. Be discreet, Florence, but not too discreet." By noon, the village hummed with the tale, whispered from shop to shop like a breeze through the hedge. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sent a note to Inspector Craddock, suggesting he station men at the mill that evening, citing a hunch based on Clara's confession and Rook's cloaked figure. Craddock, though skeptical of village rumors, trusted her instincts enough to act. He agreed to set a watch, his men hidden among the mill's crumbling walls, ready to catch anyone drawn by the bait. As dusk fell, Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting untouched, her eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the mill against the fading sky. The old structure, its wheel long stilled, stood at the edge of the village, its isolation a perfect stage for secrets. She recalled a village scandal where a whispered rumor had lured a thief to retrieve hidden loot, his greed betraying him to watchful eyes. Tonight, she hoped, the mill would yield a similar truth. Craddock's men, cloaked in shadows, waited as the mist thickened, their breath hushed in the damp air. Miss Marple, though not present, had arranged to receive word from a young constable, a neighbor's boy eager to please. Hours passed, the village clock striking 9, then 10, before a breathless knock came at her door. The constable, his cap askew, stood panting, his eyes wide with news. "Miss Marple, we got him," he blurted. "Mr. Gryce, at the mill, digging, like a madman. He had a shovel, and when we moved in, he pulled a knife, but the inspector took him down. There was a pouch in his coat, the sapphire, miss, and a rag with blood on it." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. "Well done, my dear boy. And Mr. Gryce, what did he say?" The constable gulped, catching his breath. "He was in a panic. Miss said he lured Slade to the mill, wanting the sapphire for himself. When Slade wouldn't hand it over, Gryce hit him hard with the shovel. Hid the body in a shallow grave, nearby. The shovel we found at the manor. He buried it, to cover his tracks." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the fire as she pieced together the scene. Gryce's greed, as she had suspected, had turned to violence. his role as fence giving way to a darker ambition. The blood-stained rag was a grim confirmation. The sapphire's glint, a motive as old as avarice. She recalled a village butcher who had betrayed a partner over stolen goods, his desperation leaving clues as clear as blood on a slab. "Thank you, my dear," she said, pressing a coin into the constable's hand. "Tell Inspector Craddock I'll call on him tomorrow. He's done well, and so have you." As the boy left, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting needles resuming their soft click. The trap at the mill had worked, drawing Grice into the open like a moth to a flame. Yet questions lingered. Clara's role, though clarified by her confession, left her culpable as an accomplice. And Rook's presence at the manor suggested he knew more than he admitted. The cloaked figure, she mused, was surely Grice, his tall frame matching Rook's description, his haste at the mill confirming his guilt. She recalled a village feud where a farmer's greed had led to a stolen calf, hidden until a neighbor's rumor flushed him out. Grice's actions mirrored that betrayal, his shovel and pouch the tools of his treachery. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Craddock, whose doubt had nearly derailed him, but whose diligence had prevailed. She would meet him tomorrow, to ensure the loose threads Clara's complicity, Rook's spying were neatly tied. As the fire dwindled, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of a puzzle nearing completion. The Ashford sapphire was recovered, but the cost of its theft a life. Perhaps more lay heavy on St. Mary Mead. The truth, like a buried seed, had been unearthed, and Miss Marple's patient hand had guided it to light, as surely as she tended her roses. Chapter 12. The unraveling. The morning sun broke through the mist over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a gentle light that belied the dark drama of the previous night. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room, her knitting needles moving, with their familiar rhythm, the soft click, a counterpoint to the quiet satisfaction in her heart. The trap at the old mill had ensnared Mortimer Grice, his greed unmasked by the glint of the Ashford sapphire and a blood-stained rag, revealing the grim fate of Victor Slade. Yet the tapestry of the theft was not fully woven, and Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as the frost on her roses, knew that the final threads Clara Vane's complicity, Julian Rook's spying, and Inspector Craddock's redemption must be drawn together to complete the picture. The village hall was chosen for the denouement, a fitting stage for truths to be laid bare. Miss Marple arrived early, her black brocade dress and modest hat lending her the air of a benevolent aunt, though her eyes gleamed with the clarity of a hawk. The hall was abuzz with villagers, their whispers hushed as Craddock prepared to address them, his suit crisp, but his face still marked by the strain of the case. Clara Vane sat near the front, her auburn hair subdued under a gray scarf, her fingers twisting nervously. Julian Rook slouched by a window, his fox-like grin replaced by a wary scowl. Grice, under guard, was absent, his fate sealed by the night's events, but his shadow loomed large. Craddock began, his voice steady, though Miss Marple noted a flicker of gratitude in his glance toward her. "Ladies and gentlemen, the theft of the Ashford sapphire has been solved, thanks to diligent police work and certain insights from a valued friend. Mortimer Grice, the jeweler, has confessed to murdering Victor Slade and stealing the sapphire. The gem is recovered, and justice will be served." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Miss Marple rose, her voice soft, yet carrying the weight of truth. "If I may, Inspector, there are details the village deserves to know, for clarity's sake. Like a tangled skein of wool, this case needed careful unraveling." Craddock nodded, stepping aside, and Miss Marple faced the room, her hands clasped lightly, her eyes scanning the faces before her. Victor Slade was a thief of great skill, but his ambition was his undoing. He planned the theft with Clara Vane, whose lockpicking opened the manor's safe. "Clara, my dear, you admitted your part, but your fear at the mill was genuine. You expected to meet Slade, not to find him gone. Clara's face crumpled, her scarf slipping as she nodded. I helped him, yes, but I didn't know he'd be taken. I waited at the mill, heard footsteps, and ran. I thought he'd betrayed me. Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her voice remained firm. You were betrayed, but not by Slade. Mortimer Gryce, his fence, saw a chance to claim the sapphire for himself. He lured Slade to the mill, demanding the gem. When Slade refused, Gryce struck him with a shovel, hiding the body in a shallow grave. The shovel, buried later at the manor, was his attempt to erase his crime. But greed leaves traces, like Mrs. Carter's stolen pie, found by a crumb on her table. She turned to Rook, whose scowl deepened. Mr. Rook, your envy of Slade Lead. You two spy on him at the manor. You saw Gryce follow him, cloaked to avoid notice, yet you said nothing, fearing your own presence would implicate you. Your muddy boots told a story, as did a village poacher's once, caught by a single track. Rook shifted, his voice low. I didn't kill him. I just wanted to see him fail. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes moving to Craddock. Inspector, your guilt over a past failure nearly clouded your sight, but you followed the clues: the silk, the shovel, the pouch. Like Mr. Harrow, who found truth once he set guilt aside, you've done well. Craddock's cheeks flushed, but he stood taller, his voice clear. Gryce is in custody, charged with murder and theft. Miss Vane will face charges as an accomplice, though her cooperation may lighten her sentence. Mr. Rook, you're free, but I'd advise less boasting in future. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others whispering, as the weight of the truth settled over them. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting bag at her side, her heart light with the resolution of a puzzle well solved. She recalled a village scandal where a stolen locket had unraveled a web of deceit, the truth emerging as inevitably as spring after winter. As the hall emptied, Craddock approached, his expression a mix of awe and gratitude. Miss Marple, I don't know how you do it. You saw the connections I missed, turned gossip into evidence. Scotland Yard could use you. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her smile demure. Oh, Inspector, it's just a matter of watching people. They're much the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or a thief's den. Like my roses, they reveal their secrets if you tend them patiently. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her needles resuming their soft click. The scent of lavender mingled with the warmth of burning logs, and she thought of the sapphire, now safe in police hands, its brilliance dimmed by the blood it had cost. Clara's tears, Rook's retreat, Gryce's confession, Craddock's redemption, each was a thread in a tapestry of human nature, woven with the flaws of greed, envy, and guilt. She recalled a village girl who had confessed to stealing a ribbon, her remorse as clear as the tears on her cheeks. The Ashford sapphire had been a glittering lure, but the true prize was the truth, unearthed like a buried seed in the quiet heart of St. Mary Mead. As the fire dwindled, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of a puzzle complete, her heart at peace in the village she knew so well.